Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we're doing another ship comparison video, and this is another ship that has been requested by viewers. So today we are talking about the French Richelieu class battleships. That was the last class that France built during World War II, and the last class they had in operation. We are looking at the fantail of New Jersey, because this is one advantage that New Jersey has that Richelieu doesn't. We have an aft-facing turret. If you look at this picture of Richelieu, you see that she only has two forward turrets. They're both quadruple barreled, so she's got 8 barrels total for the 15-inch gun. Why did they do that? So, as early as the 1920s, Great Britain started experimenting with putting all of their turrets forward or amidship. If you can concentrate your magazines and your engine rooms, it shrinks the amount of ship that you have to armor. The armor is the big weight. So this wasn't a huge problem in World War I, but in the interwar years, you've got the Washington and London naval treaties, which are limiting the displacement of your ships. So, by concentrating your guns forward, like British designs for their G3 and N3 ships, which were never built, or their Nelson and Rodneys, which were built during the interwar years, you can shrink your armored citadel and create a more armored ship on a lighter displacement. The French tried this in the 1930s with the Dunkirk class. Some people call them battleships, some people call them battle cruisers or cruiser killers. These ships were in response to the German Deutschland class armored cruisers, pocket battleships. In response to them, Germany built the Scharnhorst class, and Italy built the Littorio class. So France needed to escalate their capital ships and build a modern, fast battleship for themselves. And that ended up being the Richelieu. She was designed to displace 35,000 tons, like other treaty battleships. Because she wasn't completed until World War II had already started, she ended up a little bit over there, 3,700 tons standard displacement, closer to 4,000 full load. Still considerably lighter than fascist battleships, which did not adhere to the treaty standards at all. How much fighting power are you losing for this reduced displacement? Honestly, not a heck of a lot. Richelieu is one of the best treaty battleships built, and one of the best battleships to come out of Europe. I would argue that she is comparable in combat value to Bismarck. The two ships have 8 15-inch guns each. The two ships have mixed battery for secondary guns. The two ships have a speed of about 30 knots each, which is very similar also for the Italian Littorio. So the extra 10,000 tons of material that Germany is spending on their ships is not getting them any extra fighting value over their French rivals. Now, one advantage that Richelieu has over Littorio is, which we filmed in last week's video, check the link down below, she has a combat range of 9,500 nautical miles, whereas the Littorio is designed for the Mediterranean only had a combat range of 4,500 nautical miles. So this means that Richelieu has some utility. France has colonies all over the world. They're not just operating in the Mediterranean. This ship can be used to hunt the Atlantic for German raiders. It can be used in the Mediterranean to hunt Italian battleships. Or it can be sent to the Far East to French colonies, such as French Indochina, where Richelieu was deployed in the immediate post-war years. The 8 15-inch guns were in 2 quadruple turrets, but those turrets were separated by some distance, so a single shot couldn't knock both out, and they had an armored bulkhead down the middle, so they were, in essence, two twin turrets paired together. So if one half of the turret was knocked out, in theory, the other half could still function. If something damaged the rotation of the turret, though, you're still losing half of your battery. Again, those turrets are concentrated at the bow. They do not have any firepower aft from their main guns, but really, their arc of fire is only limited by some 60 or 80 or so degrees off the exact stern. So if they are running dead ahead of an enemy, they don't have anything to shoot. But otherwise, they can bring their guns to bear at most angles. The stern of the ship is protected by 9 6-inch guns, and they were designed to have another 6-inch guns as well, but I don't believe any of those were ever fitted to any of the ships of this class. They had, like other European battleships at the time, a mixed anti-aircraft battery. The 6-inch guns were supposed to help with anti-aircraft, but functionally they didn't. They couldn't aim fast enough, so they didn't really work that well. And they had some 100mm anti-aircraft guns, and the number of them changes over the life of this ship, and it's supplemented with other things. And then they had other lighter weapons, which again, they had what they were designed to have, and they had what they actually had. The issue was these ships were not completed until World War II had already started. Both ships were still, both ships that were close to completion, which is to say Richelieu and Jean Bart, were under construction when the war began and were quickly gotten out of France when Germany invaded. Both were taken to North Africa, and Richelieu was more or less fully placed in commission. Jean Bart was missing one of her turrets and a lot of her secondary guns and was generally not ready to go. She didn't even have a full paint job at the time. The other two ships of this class, which were authorized later, Clemenceau and Gascon, were nowhere near completion, and these two designs were going to be slightly different. So each of the 4 ships of this class ended up being basically its own subclass, but broadly similar weapons, displacement, etc. All based off of the same hull. Striking features of this ship are its MAC, which is a combined mast smokestack. This is a very forward-looking innovation. So the aft fire control tower had the exhaust gases for the 2 engine rooms, or the 2 fire rooms, trunked through it, and this saved superstructure space. She had float plane facilities back aft. Let's see, armor. Designers hoped to get 14-inch armor on the ship. In reality, they ended up with 13-inch armor, and they had to angle it. It wasn't quite as layered as other countries' armor, but it was still probably about as effective as New Jersey's or Littoria's or any of these other ships. She had reasonable deck armor. Her torpedo defense is interesting. I would have liked to have seen this actually in use. It was fairly deep, which is usually the biggest indicator of how successful torpedo defense will be. It didn't have many partitions like American torpedo defense, which feature 5 layers, but it was partially filled with rubber, so that if an explosion hit there, it couldn't flood with water, and it's even more buoyant than air. So it would be interesting to see how that worked, and how that worked for the long-term preservation of the ships, because if water does leak in there, well, now the rubber's holding it against the steel. If one of these ships had survived to be a museum ship, I suspect they would have serious preservation issues. Also prevented them from having the same fuel capacity of American ships, but it's an interesting feature. And I can't think of any other ships that have similar hydrophobic compounds as part of their torpedo defense, at least not in such a broad use. So, Richelieu retreats to North Africa. She is attacked by the Allies on a number of different occasions, and then eventually French North Africa switches sides to the Free French, and Richelieu is sent to the United States and gets refit with a modern anti-aircraft suite. Jean Bart is defending French North Africa, even though she's incomplete, and she is shelled by the American battleship Massachusetts, and pretty well disabled by a few hits from Massachusetts, which shows that New Jersey's guns were capable of defeating the French armor and doing considerable damage. Jean Bart was never fully commissioned during the war, and in the post-war years, the French Navy was trying to decide if they wanted to turn her into an aircraft carrier, go the modern way, or just complete her as a battleship, go the cheap way. And eventually they completed her as a battleship in 1955, which made her the last battleship fully commissioned anywhere in the world. Although she had seen use earlier, so arguably the Iowas, which were taken in and out of commission, still fit that criteria. But her official formal first commissioning was the last. She was used briefly. She was sent to the Suez Canal during the Suez Crisis. She was kept around during all the French colonial mishaps of the later 20th century. But mostly she was used as a training ship and a barrack ship. And by the 1960s, she and Richelieu were both completely out of service. And by the 1970s, they've both been scrapped. The other battleships, Gascon and Clemenceau, were never completed and were scrapped on the ways. So, how do they compare? Again, they don't really compare too favorably to New Jersey. New Jersey has bigger guns and a higher speed, and more modern anti-aircraft, electronics, all of that. The armor's pretty comparable, but armor is New Jersey's dump stat. It's our lowest statistic, so it's not that great. You try to compare Richelieu to this ship, it's not that favorable. You compare it to any of her European peers at the time, the British King George V class, the German Bismarck class, which is considerably heavier, the Italian Littorio class, which also is considerably heavier, and she stacks up pretty evenly for a much smaller investment in resources. So I would consider this a very successful design, and probably the most successful treaty design to come out of Europe. Well, I shouldn't say the most successful. The King George V class had a lot of successes in actual combat, but on paper, the best design to come out of that period, in my opinion. The only treaty battleship that I would rank higher than her would be the American South Dakota class, which is a slightly slower Iowa. But the South Dakotas were designed and completed a couple years later and had much more modern electronics and anti-aircraft guns. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future videos, drop them in the comment section down below. If you are interested in supporting the channel or the museum, check the description below for ways to donate. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to get notified when we're putting out more content.